Afternoon, everybody. My name's Nicola Lacey. I am a school professor of law, gender and social policy here at LSE, and it's my very, very great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon on behalf of the LSE in general and in particular on behalf of the International Inequalities Institute to this afternoon of events celebrating the work and life of Charles Booth. As you all know, we are very, very fortunate at the LSE because we have a very substantial collection of Booth's maps and other papers in the library, and you'll be hearing from our colleague Indy Buller in a few minutes about some of the very exciting plans that the library has to make that collection even more accessible to more people. But when I became aware, thanks to my friend and colleague Emily Jackson and thanks to Christopher Stevens, one of 30 direct descendants of Charles Booth who were extremely happy to have with us today, and I would say a special word of welcome to you all, that it was to be the centenary of Charles Booth's death this year seemed an excellent opportunity to team up with our colleagues running the LSE Research Festival, which includes Mary Morgan, who you'll be hearing from in this first session, to put together an event to really celebrate and explore the legacy of Charles Booth's work and his methods and his themes for the social sciences today. The sort of work Booth did, the way in which he did it, the issues which he was so concerned about of poverty, unemployment, the implications for health, for the spatial organisation of the city, are still at the absolute core of the research mission of the LSE. So it's really a great privilege. And Lisa, could you just hang on for 1 second because I want to say something. Do you mind? I'm hanging on to Lisa for a moment that will become clear in a second, but it won't be long, Lisa, I promise. These are really at the core of the mission of the LSE, and so it's really marvellous to have this opportunity to celebrate that legacy and to explore its implications today. And we have a fantastic lineup of colleagues. We're going to keep introductions very, very brief today because we are going to really give you a sort of quick, very high-quality tour, we think, with the help of many colleagues, of the implications of Booth and his work. I just want to say, however, right at the beginning, a word of thanks. There are many, many, many people who've made today happen. The people who've worked on the Research Festival that you see all around us, the Booth family who gave us lots of support and ideas, many colleagues from across the school, the library, Indy and his colleagues have been wonderful, and of course all the speakers today. But also I want to say a special word of thanks to Lisa Ryan and Billy Enquist-Turenne, who are from the Inequalities Institute, who have really done very hard work to make sure that today happened, that you all had somewhere to sit, that there was proper publicity and so on. So I really just want to underline that, and I'm sorry I had to call you back. So could I now quickly hand over, before I introduce Mary, I'm going to hand over to Indy from the library to tell us a little bit about the collection and our plans for it.
Great stuff. Thank you, Nikki. Thanks for that introduction. My name is Indy. I work in the library. And I'm one of the curators in the library, and I work with the archives and special collections materials within the subject areas of economics and social policy. As I'm sure you'll all be aware, or be made of aware if you haven't been already during the course of today, Charles Booth's inquiry made a marked impact on both of these areas of study. The resonance of the work that he shaped and led is still being felt today, in fact, whether we look at our transport infrastructure, projects such as Crossrail, to housing policy, to how we look after our ageing populations, or issues around economic inequality. Booth and his work still has much to say to us today. My first task on starting this role as a curator was to put together the exhibition, which is based on a rich and varied archive of the inquiry, which was left to the school over the course of many years last century by members of Booth's family. The exhibition is currently on display in the library gallery space, and I'm mostly here to plug it quite shamelessly. So it's really very good, I've been told by my mum. And if you want to see some of the original documents, and including those written by Charles himself, you can take a trip over to the library, and as you enter, take a left, and there's the library gallery. Time travel has rarely been so convenient. The exhibition, as well as telling the story of how the inquiry came to be, also focuses a little on our part of the world, the LSE campus. There is an original poverty notebook, for instance, with information gleaned from one of the school board visitors for this area. In fact, a street called St. Clement's Lane. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's the street which is opposite the library and behind St. Clement's House, or the former St. Clement's House. The residents who lived there at the time were all classed as being very poor. And the note at the end of the section remarks that the houses that were on that street was due to be cleared quite soon in order to be replaced by a new bankruptcy court. Well, the road is still there, and it's still the site of a large construction project. Except this time, there are no associations with bankruptcy, we hope. In fact, it's a building which has been constructed by the school, and it will be the brand new Centre for Social Sciences, which will house, among other things, the International Inequalities Institute, which seems rather apt. The title curator has a number of different meanings and explanatory words which are associated with it. Not all of them are as polite, as my friends can attest, but two of my favourites are custodian and carer. In this regard, then, I think it's imperative that we continue as a library, as collection staff, to ensure that as custodians of such an archive as Booth, which still resonates so clearly with us, that we take care to ensure that we're making the best of such collections and bringing them to our audiences, whether within the school or more broadly. One example of the kind of work we're doing to make the collection better available is to relaunch a new and improved website which is based on the Booth archive itself in the school and the fabulous maps which draw so many people to our doors. This should be launching in late November. You don't have to remember when and the web address, because we have a stall outside with more information about the new website. And Neil Stewart, who's here today, who's our digital library manager and has been leading the project to revamp the website, create it anew, will be available during the breaks. And you can go and see our stall and see the new website in action. It's terrific, even if I do say so myself. An organisation which has very much recognised the value and importance of the Booth Archive is UNESCO. And for those of you who don't know, I'm very pleased to be able to say that in July this year, UNESCO registered the Booth Archive in the Inquiries Papers as part of its United Kingdom Memory of the World Register, where it sits comfortably alongside other documents such as the Magna Carta, the death warrant of King Charles I, and a collection of materials telling the history of the women's suffrage movement, which is also at the LSE Library. As I'm sure will be clear from today's talks, Charles Booth and his team, through a tremendous combination, curiosity, determination, will and effort, created a work which so neatly encapsulates the LSE's motto, to know the causes of things. We in the library are very proud to have an archive such as Booth's, and we know the value of the things within it, and will continue to try and make it available for inquiring minds wherever, whenever, and however we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Indy. And just while Mary Morgan is coming down, before I introduce her, let me just say that we will have a very short break. Probably it'll end up being about 5 minutes in between sessions. We understand that not everybody can stay all afternoon, so there will be an opportunity to move around. And I hope has everyone managed to find a seat now? Yes, it looks like it. Good. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Mary Morgan. Mary is a very distinguished economic historian. She holds the Albert O. Hirschman Professorship in the Economic History Department, and she uses the Booth poverty maps in our foundation course, LSE 100, which all our undergraduate students take each year. So there's really nobody better qualified at LSE to introduce Charles Booth's legacy for the social sciences than Mary. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. So this is a great pleasure for me to be talking to so many members of the Booth family here. Booth has been one of the great heroes of the history of social sciences, but a very underappreciated one, I think, despite his fame at the LSE. So I want to talk about why he's so important for the history of the social sciences and what was so clever about his poverty investigation project as a kind of foundational project in the history of the modern social sciences. The social sciences really got its act together in a way in the late 19th century, and he's right there developing all sorts of methods and all sorts of ways of thinking about things. I'm a historian, economic historian, but also a historian and philosopher of the social sciences. So for my purposes, what I'm really interested in is the way that he developed the methods he was using, and I'm interested in that because I have been working over quite a long time on the way that economic numbers do things in the public domain. So the way that the outputs of economic and social research have valency in society, what kind of work they do, and how they act, how they are one of the conduits in which social sciences helps to change the world and make it a better place, which is part of this LSE tradition. So I'm focusing not so much on him or on his context in a way, but on what he did and why it's so important to us. So here, for those of you who've never seen a picture, is an elongated one. I don't know whether I've managed to stretch it somehow, but he does look very distinguished there. And I want to talk about this object for which he's most famous, this large-scale poverty survey, in which we have him and his team, because it's a big team, acting, essentially becoming a pioneer of social surveys, which are just beginning to get going and become really important in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Poverty mapping, which arguably he introduced. There are a few precursors in different kinds of aspects of this. Defining poverty classes, which is another aspect which I think is really critical to the way we think about poverty, which he really developed. A whole project to locate the causes of poverty, almost separately and prior to the questions of measuring and creating this sense of there being lots of different groups, and what we really don't know is much about how those groups are constituted, what caused the poverty for those groups, and how many people, how many households fall into that group. So in a way, Charles Booth taught us how to do a lot of social science. There were bits there and other people doing it. He's not the only one, but he's a really critical figure in this history. So this is the object which is so much admired, which is essentially forms, I suppose, the basis of our collection. The Poverty Survey of the 1890s, and in the context of the 1890s, we had in London a large class, as in any urban centre in Britain, a large class of urban poor without social welfare, because the social welfare systems were essentially parish-based and worked not too badly in a rural environment, but really fell apart in the urban context. And in the 1880s, we had a series of strikes and riots. Not so far away, down in Trafalgar Square was one of the big ones. And so this concept of poverty in the midst of plenty was quite a common trope of the period, but no one really knew how many of the households of London were poor households. So it was quite clear there was a problem, if you like, and everyone bought into the idea that this was a problem. So state officials, the philanthropy movement, which was the social welfare was mainly delivered through philanthropic charity groups, statistical experts, because that was by at this time quite a large group of expertise, social scientists were just beginning to kind of come together into particular social science disciplines, and a group of reformers who probably crossed over between several of those groups. There were basically two analyses at the time, competing analysis. One, which was the individual fault. If you're poor, it's your fault you're poor. And the other one, which said it's the economic system that is at fault. Without becoming a Marxist, the economic system was quite well understood to be problematic in delivering a reasonable quality of life to lots of citizens. And the associated solutions that went along with that were, of course, divergent. If the group thought it was an individual fault point, the reason that people were poor, then the answer to that was to send in the charity workers, the forerunner of the social workers, to work with what is now called problem families. So essentially it's that same kind of way in which we now think of as a group of people who wouldn't have to be poor, but they are poor through some aspect of their own behaviour. As opposed to the social system reformers who thought there was something fundamentally wrong with the way the social system worked, not as a kind of giant big system like a Marxist problem, but in terms of the way individual work patterns, individual life patterns, individual enterprise patterns worked. And it's into that situation of this large class of urban poor, a widely understood view that there was a problem here, and these two really opposite analyses which had very different solutions, that we find Booth coming in, leading and financing this huge social science survey, the first large-scale systematic poverty survey, I think, of any large town, soon to be copied in various ways, not just in Britain but around the world. It's very systematic, it's published in academic journals, and it's published in 17 volumes, so it takes a long time. It involves lots and lots of different aspects. And I want to talk about two outcomes of that. One is to look at Booth's own measuring sequence, the sequence he did to get through this poverty survey. So there's a sequence which has an observation moment, a practice of defining and classifying classes of poverty, a mapping project, a project which aggregates the groups up, a project which samples them back down again in order to kind of figure out the causal structure. And because you can figure out the causal structure, you can have a handle on the solutions. There's a social science sequence itself, which is that Booth prompts a large copycat regime, if you like, and I don't want to be pejorative here. Lots of other people get involved in these poverty surveys, and we find very quickly a development of this whole branch of research. And I'm just picking out Booth, from the link between Booth and Rowntree, the Quaker chocolate manufacturer, and Bowley, professor of statistics, to show how quickly the pioneering methods of Booth generated further developments. And then an action sequence, which is what happened as a result in the public domain from these social surveys, taken up by the poverty lobby, taken up by the straight administrative system, and with activist lobbies creating a change on the ground in various kinds of poverty actions against poverty, in a very short period between 1908 and 1914. So that's the basic shape of the lecture that I want to cover. So let me start with Booth's own measuring sequence and the innovations that he was making in this. Now, Booth had a huge advantage, which anybody who is a social scientist here at the LSE will not think is an advantage. But Booth had the great advantage is that there were no systematic evidence on incomes or wages or expenditures. So he couldn't just go to the internet and download a load of data. He couldn't just find out what the average income was, what the average wage was. There was just nothing like that. There were lots of statistics on lots of things, but there was nothing there, which is a great advantage because it meant he had to get his team to go and look. Right? So he said to himself, well, who are the people who know about poverty? And he fixed very cleverly, I think, I don't know whether this was accident or whether this was clever, but it turned out to be very clever, on this group of people called school visitors. School visitors had to go to every house in every street to determine how many children there were in the household. It's not just every house, but every household. There might be several households in a house. They had to determine how many children and how poor the household was. Because if the household was very, very poor, the children didn't have to pay for school. If the household was just a little bit better off, they would have to pay a penny a week. And a bit more than that, it would be tuppence a week. I imagine that the first thing that happened when the school visitor arrived in the street was that the kids ran for it. But somehow they managed to do this. And they did it. It was like the policeman's beat. They had the same district year after year after year. So they got to know the people in their districts. Even if they are moving houses around, they probably got to know the population pretty well. And they recorded the evidence from observation of the ages, occupations, the appearance of poverty, the appearance of the housing they were in, whether it was running with damp, whether it was covered in mould, whether it was full of rats, whatever, for all the households in their district. So poverty was observed in the healthiness of the family, the nature of the accommodation, clothing, comparative destitution. So that was a kind of fundamental data set, if you like, that Booth had access to. And that was supplemented with lots of other evidence in a kind of what we would now call a process of triangulation, census records, investigations of lots of different industries and how those industries went on, sweatshops, the policemen on their beat, the charity workers, everybody who came into contact with the local population. You will find in the Booth papers a huge range of different kinds of evidence from different sources. So they were important that they come from all over the place. And on the basis of this, he defined a whole set of poverty classes. And this is another critical thing which I think we owe to Booth, this notion that we shouldn't just have poor and non-poor, but that we should be careful to think about there being different groups with different kinds of problems. And he did this because he wanted a thick definition of poverty, because he wanted to avoid having a simple poverty line notion. He thought that if you just tried to gather incomes, it wouldn't help you very much, because whether or not a household was poor depended not so much on their income, but on the size of the household, whether the breadwinner was sick or not. So all the other characteristics which his school visitors had been noting down was a critical part as to whether a household was very poor with irregular earnings, or poor with regular earnings, but they were low, regular earnings, middle class. So there's a whole set of different classes that he defined. So poor for him was sufficient to just get by with this kind of decencies of life. So there's a whole range. In fact, there's 4 different classes of poor. There's 2 then further working class groups who are relatively well off before you even get to middle class and wealthy. And the very poor, who are those who fall way below this standard and live in a chronic state of want. But there's a very important group, actually, which is most of the group, which is those who have regular or irregular income, either regular and very low or irregular income. And I think it's important to understand something about the structure of employment, which is where the economic system comes in here. A lot of jobs were casual and temporary. Even if you had a job which might seem to be relatively skilled, like a house painter, you could only work 6 months of the year because the paint in those days only dried in the summer. If you were a dock worker, which is not just a question of manual labour, but also a certain amount of skill, you would go and line up at the dock gate every morning and hope to be picked by the foreman. And maybe you'd get picked 2 days, maybe you'd get picked 3 days, maybe you'd get picked no days. So a lot of jobs were casual and seasonal. And then there's a lot of jobs below that even weren't casual and seasonal: messenger boys, taking and washing, selling various kinds of things. There's a huge part of the population which has no secure employment. And in a way, I mean, one could give this lecture 25 years ago and this would sound really bizarre, but of course now we're used to 0 hours contracts and all of these other kind of things which are bringing back in those kind of work patterns. So defining the poverty class is not on the basis of income, but on the basis of these kind of characteristics about the nature of their income stream, not the actual income level. So regular work or irregular work. Okay, so at this point he hasn't even got a poverty number yet, but he allocates, using the information on all of these kinds of occupations, not on their income levels or wage levels, but on their work patterns. He manages to allocate all the households into his 8 classes, and that's when he turns them in to the first poverty maps, which I'm sure most of you have seen. This is based on looking at every household in the east of the city and every street to the west of the city. This is Lincoln's Inn Fields here. I don't know whether you can see, there's a nice black area here where we are at this moment. Red is middle class, yellow up near Bloomsbury, where you see is our rivals, is nice and upper class. But we are essentially in black, which is the slum area. This is the police no-go area where we currently are, on the edge of Lincoln's Inn Fields, and Trafalgar Square's down here. And you can see that as you move eastwards, you get more blue, but you can also see that blue is essentially interleaved with red. You know, any main street is red. Blue is the back streets. So it's not as if there's whole areas which are blue. Blue is integrated in with the red, which is why people have this sense at the time of poverty being everywhere, but still not having a grip about how big that is. So the colour-coded poverty maps, they're not the first ever maps of this kind, but they're the first real poverty maps. There are health maps that are significant before this. Adding up at that point gave him 30.7% of London households live in poverty. It's a kind of spurious accuracy about the 0.7%, but roughly speaking, we can say 30% of households in poverty. Now, that would seem like a huge achievement, and let's stop there. But he didn't. And because most importantly, what he goes on to do is to figure out something about the causal structure of poverty and the kind of people who are poor. Now, this is where he wants to go beyond households to some extent. So what he did was disaggregate again that aggregate that he kind of forgot, go back down to the individual observations, and looked at a group to see what kind of people were in poverty. By kind of people, I mean what kind of circumstances: children, widows, widowers, married, unmarried, and so forth. So family structure of the poor classes. And by linking occupational information, again, remember, it's not wages, but it's work patterns, to the personal information, he looked at a sample of 4,000 households. So, you know, he's done everything by now. He's surveyed, he's aggregated, he's got to samples, every kind of possible social science space. And he used that sample to find a numerical analysis which got him to the causes of poverty. Here's a table not directly from him, but put together by someone from all his results, which is the very poorest 2 classes, the bottom 2 classes, the black and the very dark blue. And here's the analysis of the causes of great poverty. And there's this wonderful word, loafers. I was delighted to find it was an Edwardian term. And you can see that that's, of the 4,000 families he's got, 1,610 fall into this bottom 2 classes, poverty A and B. 4% of those 1,610 are loafers. That's essentially a description for people who are judged to not want to work for whatever reason. The questions of habit, drunkenness, drink, husband or wife, drunkenness, ridiculous wife, is 14%. Now, add 14 to 4 and you get 18%. So let me go back to that initial point about there being 2 analyses of poverty. There's the people who say, it's your fault, and they're going to be helped by the charity come social workers. Well, only 18% of our bottom 2 classes are going to be individual faults. In other words, this kind of completely divides up and settles the question of the poverty problem of, you know, where should you start? Should you start with the individual families, or should you start with the system problem? Only 18% of these 1,610 families in sample could fall into that analysis of the charity side. But the other side, 55%, is the questions of employment. That's the structure of the economic system. Irregular work, casual work, low pay, small profits. That's small industry, small retail probably. And the other 27% is to do with these personal circumstances, large family, illness with a large family combined with irregular work. So 80, excuse me, whatever that is, 55 plus 27, 82% is due to the economic system. Right, so going back to that beginning point of what the argument is at the time, I think this whole poverty survey really lays out the issue of what kind of action you can take given this kind of structure. So what this whole kind of analysis looking at the kinds of people who are poor and the analysis of what the causal structure of their poverty in that table is one of the great things we get from Booth is how important it is to think of poverty as multidimensional in aspect is observed, and in causes. So there's a whole lot of systemic things in the system. So if you are poor health, you have poor housing, you can't work very well, you're going to be poor, which is going to be a cycle that goes round. So all of these bits are part of the puzzle of why the number of poor in London remain poor because of this multidimensional aspect. Poverty essentially causes poverty. How am I doing? Okay. So Booth has made a tremendous achievement in this survey. I mean, it's not just him. There's a whole team of people. They're doing lots of different things, as I've said. But he's got through a tremendous agenda. He's figured out how many households are poor. He's done that by observing households. He's done that by then defining poverty classes based on these observations that he's got. He's created this analysis about how you turn this evidence into numbers of poverty in a way which has given him access to the causal structure of poverty and the characteristics of those people who are poor. And let me say again, had he just gone to the internet and downloaded those average incomes, he would have had none of that. Right? So the whole benefit of not knowing any numbers turns into this huge positive outcome because he's not only developed these social science methods, but found all these sort of answers to lots of questions of the time. Now, it's not just that I, as a historian and philosopher of social science, think he's the bee's knees, but he was thought to be, this was a fantastic piece of work, well recognised at the time. Just let me talk about a couple of the followers. C-Bun Rowntree, a member of the Rowntree Chocolate Company, Quaker, run in York, was very struck by this poverty survey and he immediately went out to wonder about York and compare York. And he had his own little team. He observed every household in York. That's 11,500 households. He surveyed 46,000 people in 6 months. It's a pretty impressive kind of project. In other words, he repeated Booth with Booth's poverty classes. But he actually was a chemist by training and wanted to develop what he thought of as what is your minimum income that you need to get on in life or to keep life together as a poor family. So he's the first person that historians of science recognize as producing the first poverty line. And that's based on this notion of physical efficiency, which sounds a little bit awkward to us, but it was based on a nutritional requirement that every person needed, plus an allowance for rent and soap and matches and all of these other things that one needed in life. So he's the person who creates the first poverty line. And he put his primary poverty line in 1911 for an income line for a family with 2 adults and 2 children, sorry, this is in 1902, at 18 shillings. At that point, the average family income in these bottom 2 classes that Booth was looking at was 11 shillings or 19 shillings, depending on the class. And the average male household was always learning below that. So this poor house could only be making that poverty line if more than one of them was working. And those amounts were way, when insurance and unemployment pay came in, they were much, much lower than those poverty lines. So essentially he was creating the next step, using the same methods of Booth, creating the next step, which is to create this poverty line, a sort of sustainable income line. And he found much the same level of poverty. Just let me show you this one because it's so wonderful. This is one I don't think anybody's actually taken this one up, but this is Roundtree's Life Cycle of Poverty. So like Booth, he was very innovative in the way he thought about how you should investigate this and how you should show this. This is a timeline of what happens to you. You're born, so this is you in the household. You're born, and when you're born, you're breastfed, so you're above the poverty line. As you get a little bit older, there's more siblings come along and you fall below the poverty line, and you're still below the poverty line until wonderfully you go out to work and you start to earn, so you're above the poverty line. Then you marry, okay, then you get kids and you're below the poverty line, and you when your children go out to work and you go above the poverty line, your children leave home, bad news, and you get too old to work. So there's a nutshell of the individual in the household. Right? So you can see this is a period of immense kind of innovation in the way to think about poverty and how to represent poverty and how to think, how to show the problems. This is a kind of nutshell view of child poverty, old age poverty, right? And it's sort of there in front of you. Here's another big innovation. Bowley, who became a professor of statistics at LSE, at the time he was a lecturer, he said, why are you interviewing every household? You don't need to do this. You could randomly sample. You could go to every 10th household, every 12th household. And he used this method to look up, to survey 4 other towns in which he found very close results to those of London and York. He used Roundtree's physical efficiency, so he uses Booth's classes, Roundtree's poverty line, but goes to random sampling. And this is the first ever use of random sampling. Right? So it's not just Booth that has these innovations, but the Booth Poverty Project sparks off lots of other innovations. Okay, so what we've got is a measuring sequence from Booth, a social science sequence prompted by Booth into people like Roundtree and Bowley and lots of others. And the important thing about Booth, which I pointed to, was the fact that he uncovered some of the causal structures. That, of course, is LSE's motto, to know the causes of things. Why do we care about that? Because the other half of LSE's kind of mission is that you want to use the objectively found social science knowledge to improve society. And we find the Booth project is very much part of that action sequence. The social survey helps create this poverty lobby, which creates a state reaction and creates a number of changes. In a nutshell, I don't know how Winston Churchill always looked middle-aged, but he does. Winston Churchill, aged 30, and Beveridge, who later becomes LSE's director, aged 31. But at this time, he's a bona fide social scientist doing economic number stuff. But he's also heavily involved in a kind of set of networks between politics and academic life and the state. And he acts with Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill's just been made his first ministerial position, and he wants to do something to show, that he's made it. And Beveridge persuades Churchill to do various things which are actually part of the poverty lobby agenda. One I know which was close to Charles Booth's heart, which is the provision of old age state pensions. Now, one tends to think in the UK that the welfare state came along in 1944 with Beveridge. But in fact, when you look at this list of things that were achieved before the First World War as a result of the poverty lobby building off Booth's information set, we get the state provision of old age pensions in 1908, local exchanges for unemployment, 1909, trade boards for sweatshop labourers, 1909, beginning of state insurance for sickness, not all trades covered in 1911, and slum clearances, which we create model buildings on health grounds. Here we are back to our maps. That's the corner I showed you before with Lincoln's Inn Field and the slum where LSE is. This is what happened. Because that slum was cleared out, mostly, the old Curiosity Shop is still there, and the Aldwych was built, and Kingsway was built. So Drury Lane is almost the only lane that's clearly unchanged by this. So we are sort of on that site there. And here's where we are. We are actually here, And you can see that in the old map, there's lots of little lanes. I think you referred to one of them. So when you go around the LSE, there's all these little passageways, and that's the original street plan. And the Aldwych and Kingsway are blasted through the middle, and the LSE is now all part of this site, and the NAB is that corner there. So that's, one of the outcomes of this poverty lobby, which could not have happened without Booth's project. Okay, now, of course, Booth's agenda still matters. I'm not just a historian because I think we should do history. I think this most important project is because essentially it captures a lot of the issues. Poverty, of course, is still a problem. Poverty, like development, is this very multidimensional project, term. It covers lots of things. It's multidimensional aspect and multidimensional causes. And because those two terms have the same kind of characteristics, they need to keep Booth's example in line, that the thicker and more informative definitions are absolutely needed alongside any thin measurements and thin definitions. Right? So it's really important to keep that spirit, that notion that you need to think about observation and lots of different aspects of a problem when you're dealing with these big things like poverty or development. And if you're interested, like I am, in the way these things get measured, that means the measurement structures have to also carry that ability to spread over these multidimensionalities. We still need explanations of causes in order to access the policy possibilities. And now, of course, we think of poverty as this very international issue. So this is my view of what the Booth project is now. These have now been replaced, but this is the Millennium Development Goals, which you might have recalled under the headline, Make Poverty History. And the point about this is that the multi-development is just like poverty and development go along together. The multidimensional aspect and its causes, you can't measure any of these things directly. You can measure them indirectly. You might get somewhere on universal primary education. But essentially what happens is that the people who are trying to grapple with this don't try and measure it directly. On this occasion, they had 8 goals: eradicate poverty, achieve universal primary education, etc. Each of those goals has a number of targets, and each of those targets is not measured directly, but has something called a set of indicators. So each of those targets has a set of indicators which are telling you something about one of those targets, which are telling you about one of those goals. It's very structurally similar to the poverty project as Booth laid it out. There's lots of different aspects of poverty, there's lots of different aspects of development, and you need to keep them as a map and not think when you've got a measure of one of them that you've cracked it. And this is what we've replaced that by, which has got 17 goals, 169 targets, and more than 450 indicators. Right, so this is out of Booth to the power of 10 problem. Okay, but the reason I'm so keen on Booth and think he's so important is because he realised that, not in these kind of modern terminologies, but essentially he realised it's that kind of a problem and you have to think about it in a very broad way. So, thank you. At the Research Festival outside afterwards, please find the library table, check out the Booth maps. It's actually one of the great things about these maps is you can go along to the library table where the Neil is going to be, and you can tell him your postcode. No?
In central London.
In central London. One of the great things is if you have a postcode in central London, you put it in and you can find out exactly what was going on the Booth map. It's great. So Neil would be on the library table. And also, of course, I hope that you'll check out the posters, photos, and abstracts. Some of those are for the Booth project that are surrounding the outside here, which have been done by LSE students and LSE faculty. Thank you.
Mary, thank you so much for that tour de force as well as a tour d'horizon of Booth's work and its significance today. I think we could take 5 minutes, and what I'm going to suggest is that I take perhaps 2 or 3 questions and collect them for Mary to respond to. And I'd be really grateful if you could say very briefly who you are and to keep your question very brief. Would anybody like to ask a question? Yes, and then, yeah. So Deborah and then, yeah.
Deborah Kusnavik from
I was struck by the way that analysis of types didn't include any concept of unemployment. And I wondered if you'd like to say something about where the concept of unemployment comes into this, and what point it sort of emerges from the data or is cumulative.
Do you want to take two?
I'm going to take two. Can I take this? I think a member of the Booth family. Yeah.
I'm Morton Smith. I'm a great-granddaughter of Charles Booth. I'm just interested whether it's possible for you to be able to explain to us what the old age pension in 1909 was. I think it was 5 or 7 shillings a week for anyone who was 60. Is that right? And I'm just wondering how that compares with the huge amount you get today. What that would have been in present day money.
And one more.
My name's John Musson. I'm a great grandson of Charles Booth. I'm just intrigued where he nicked the idea for the colour of the map from. Sorry, where you got it from?
Okay, I don't. Well, it's not for me to say whether he nicked it or not. When I talked about Booth, because as you can tell, I'm just really enthusiastic about Booth. I talked about him in various locations, and the only response I've had about the precursors have been the health maps of people like John Snow mapping out the causes of cholera. I don't believe those are coloured. Yes, they're plotting death spots of different sources. And I've looked at various ones prompted by Booth, which use colours, and sometimes they're very different kind of structures of what they're, the ones in Chicago, one of the things that they're doing is colouring different ethnicities. I don't think there's a traditional colour mapping before that, but I'd love to be told that I've just missed a whole chunk of something. I think, and it must have been quite difficult to produce these things, I think. Okay, unemployment. Old age pensions, when they first came in, paid 5 shillings a week. And the average male head of household in the poorest, the very, very poorest family was earning 4 shillings, so it's a little bit more than that. But the next class up, which is still very poor, is getting 15 shillings. So it's about a third of one of the lowest levels. So I have no idea how that compares with today, but that's what I can tell you. I mean, it's that 5 shillings is about a third of Rowntree's poverty line. So if that's what we're thinking about it in terms of sort of minimum wage, what's this other one, living wage amount, that would be close to it. Unemployment concept, it's a really interesting question. There is no, I don't think there's a concept of unemployment which does much work at this point, because so many people are, I think the concept of employment is also not quite clear in that same way, right? Because in a sense having unemployment means you also have a concept of employment. So people are doing jobs and they are kind of employed, but what counts as employed is such a range of things, and so many of the jobs which became employed were not employed in the sense that these people like dockers, I don't think they would have described themselves as employed, right? Because so much of it was casual. My understanding is that the notion of unemployment really begins to get serious in the late 19th, early 20th century. I think if you have something called an unemployment exchange, then you've got something like a concept of unemployment, and that grows up. Those are first found and created in Bismarck's Germany. So actually, when Winston Churchill and Beveridge set them up here, they're copying the German example. But what they're doing when they copy the German example is actually throwing out the trade unions' role. One of the trade unions' roles is that they create those quite effective formal exchanges for their I don't want to say employment, but their occupation. So occupations is a clear category. And as I say, the trade unions are, of course, are delivering social welfare, employment exchange, all sorts of things. And those, to some extent, don't really like these moves by the state because they feel they're being pushed out quite a lot of their roles for their members.
Thank you, Mary. I think at that point we probably ought to draw this session to a close, just so in case people do need to move around, stretch their legs. So we will start again very promptly at 3:15, and please join me in once again thanking both of you.